here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Juan Rincón. I'm a journalist, but today I'm extremely excited to get the chance to talk to Dr. Ramani Durvasula. She's a doctor in clinical psychology. She's a college professor, but most importantly, you're probably the most famous voice about narcissism right now in the world.
Yes, thank you. I
And
don't know if that's good.
and she wrote this amazing book. I actually had the chance to read it last year when in
Thank
English. And I'm really excited that it is now in Spanish. And so the idea for this talk is we're gonna speak for about an hour about the topic at hand, and then you're gonna get the chance to ask the doctor any questions you guys have. So, doctor, how have you liked Colombia? I know we have a lot of narcissists, you know.
So, I've heard about how your country is run.
Yeah.
That's where you're worried about the narcissism.
Yeah.
I also, one thing people have said to me is there's a big gap between those who have and those who don't have.
Mhm.
And the greater that gap in any country, the greater we see that narcissism is rewarded in that country, right? So the more we see that, because it's really a complete lack of awareness of what vulnerable people are going through, right? So that, but I have to say, the warmth, the kindness, so everyone at FILBO, how helpful. I mean, it's just been absolutely wonderful. So I'm so happy to be here, and you have wonderful potatoes. I must say, really, it's a whole level of potato chip I didn't know I could have this.
Well, I'm glad you're enjoying them. So I wanted to start by something you mentioned at the end of the book, and it's that there is this discussion about calling things for what they are, right? So people say, no, you cannot talk about toxic relationships, and in the case of narcissism, they say you cannot talk about other people as being a narcissist. And I know there's like a discussion around it. Why do you think it's such a difficult topic for a lot of people?
This is such a good question, and I wish I had a better answer. It's as though many people out there think that using this term narcissistic is name calling.
Yeah.
Right? It's dismissive.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, one of the problems we're facing right now is in social media and the internet. People are using this word very dismissively, and it is a subtle word, right? We've had people, I'll give you a silly example, but people will say, this evening, even your Bogotá traffic makes Los Angeles look like a small town. But if somebody says, oh, I had to sit in the traffic in Bogotá, that was traumatic. That's not traumatic. You know what I'm saying? Like that. So I think it's that people are concerned that there's a dismissive use of this word, but it's when we can name something, we can give a survivor something to understand. And just because people are using the word incorrectly, number one, doesn't mean we should not talk about this. But number two, and I really believe this, the field of mental health has failed people who are going through these relationships. The tendency is to go to them and say, what is your part of this? What are you doing wrong? We blame the person in the relationship. We sometimes even say, well, why don't you just leave? When it's often not safe, or it's a family member, where it's not as simple, especially in a family-orientated culture like Colombia, most South American countries, many cultures. You can't just say, I'm not going to speak to my mother anymore. I'm not going to speak to my father. And yet this is a harmful person in someone's life. So they're having to navigate a very tricky space, but we won't even have the conversation in the field. I will be honest, this has made me a very controversial figure. Like I recently, just a few weeks ago, I gave a public presentation like this, and somebody on the stage actually started publicly insulting me to an audience because they didn't agree with this. And again, I've learned radical acceptance, stay calm, don't get into the fight. And she was basically trying to allege that narcissism is just a fad, a passing fancy. And when she was done dismantling me and insulting me, I took the microphone back and I said, I wish this was a fad. I wish this was just a passing fancy. I have worked with patients who are 70 and 80 years old, right? So older patients who have been in narcissistic relationships for 40, 50 years. And many of them say to me, one of the greatest sadnesses of my life was that this work that's out there now, I wish I had a name for this 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
Many therapists kept saying, you need to try harder, you need to try harder. But if I knew this was something, I would have stepped away. But no one explained to me the central truth of narcissism. It really doesn't change. So this is it. This pattern is it. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing I as a therapist can do. And I have worked with many, many narcissistic clients in my practice. It doesn't necessarily mean you just have to leave. That's not always an option. But what it means is you cannot wait for a change that is simply never going to come. You have to adjust within yourself how you interact within the limitations of this relationship.
I think it's something that struck me about the book, and I think it's a fascinating choice you make, and it's even one may even call it a political choice, is that you are firmly in the side of the survivors. And you say, listen, and in the book you say, like, I'm not here to talk about how we can heal the narcissist, we can change it. No, I'm interested in the survivors. And I wanted to share something with you. When I announced I was going to speak to you, one of my dearest friends said, please tell the doctor she saved my life. And I was like, like in awe, because I didn't know. And then we had this long conversation about it. But then a lot of people have come to me and said, hey, I love the doctor, I love the work she's doing because I've been in this and this and this. And I guess my first question, now that you mentioned survivors, is this is a very, like, it's so common, it's hard to understand why we don't name it more often. And I don't know if you can share some like stories of patients or things that have led you to understand that this is something that you should do your entire life because we need to help the survivors.
Yeah, I mean, here, think about this. Okay, in the 1970s, in the United States, okay, that was, and I think in other parts of the world, but I only know that in this United States, it was the first time we ever talked about domestic violence. The idea that if a spouse hit another spouse, it was often a husband hitting a wife, that this was wrong, rather than this is just what happens in a marriage and it's a private matter, right? Interestingly, it took only till now, these last 10 years, for there to be a willingness to have a conversation about why would somebody beat their spouse?
Yeah.
Why would somebody harm the person they say they love and have children with and marry? I have to tell you, in my work and in talking to many advocacy organizations, in 10 days' time, I'll be in Dallas talking to a whole huge collection of people focused on gender-based violence. In almost every single case, the perpetrator is narcissistic. They're entitled. They don't have empathy. They are pathologically selfish. They cannot regulate their emotions. They manipulate the story and say, she made me do it. It's her fault I did this, right? It's all narcissism. Now, in the 1970s, in the domestic violence movement, there was a resistance to naming it narcissism because for the longest time, we thought this was a disorder. This is not a disorder. This is a personality style, and this is who this person is. And for years, we put all our resources, our research, our money into trying to fix the perpetrator. Meanwhile, the people being harmed were going deeper into complex trauma. They did not have money. They did not have safety. They were stigmatized and ostracized by their communities. That paradigm had to shift. And here's the key piece. The reason I've spoken to so many people in the domestic violence world, I said, here's why you have to understand it as narcissism. Because this person's not going to change. So there's no version of this person going back into this marriage or this relationship and being safe And if you're not telling someone that, you're putting them in harm's way. The money should be going into housing, into financial programs, into legal protections for the person being harmed. That's an example of why we need to name this and also roll up to the brutal conversation that this doesn't really change. But many people in the world of mental health hold a lot of privilege, right? And the people who hold the privilege hold the power. And nobody wants what we call the status quo to be challenged. Everybody wants to think marriages are great and families are great. Sometimes they're not. And that's uncomfortable. I understand that. But we've been willing to sacrifice millions of people to maintain these ideals and not attend to the needs, the traumas, the losses, and the pain of people who have been hurt by another person's narcissism. And our systems, our courts, our governments, our law enforcement also don't know how to respond and always think both people are responsible.
And you do make a point in the book to make a difference between what the DSM says about, the narcissistic disorder and what you mean by narcissism. And you also make a point of saying it is wrong to call everybody that has wronged us a narcissist.
Yes. Yes.
So what do we talk about when we talk about somebody that is a narcissist?
Right. So I made this point yesterday when I was giving a talk in the FILBO. I'm going to make that point again here, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself. But I'll use a different example though. I'll say, if I came to your house with a chicken, you wouldn't thank me for bringing you soup. You thank me for bringing you a chicken. What would make it soup would be the water and the carrot and the potato and the vegetable, right? All together, that's soup. It's the same way with narcissism. It's all these ingredients that have to occur together. So just because a person is selfish, that does not make them narcissistic. They're selfish. Selfish people are often very immature, right? It's your friend who always says, we have to go to the restaurant I want, or we have to take a selfie again, or, this immature, but you often don't think of them as harmful. You just think they're maybe ridiculous, right? A person who is entitled is not necessarily narcissistic. A person who's entitled may have grown up with vast money, so they're not accustomed to waiting in a line, right? They're accustomed to just things going like this. So when they have to come down and live amongst the rest of us, they're like, what is this line? But you're like, well, this is what we do. We wait. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So the entitlement's not enough. You have to have the pathological selfishness, the entitlement, the arrogance, the low empathy, the inability to be able to manage frustration and react with rage. It's very superficial. There's no depth to relationship. The relationship exists to serve the narcissistic person's need. The grandiosity. I'm the most special. I'm the most perfect, right? All of that's happening together. And it translates into very specific behaviors like manipulation, like gaslighting. There's so many. I'm like, I don't know which one to say next.
Yeah.
Like devaluation. They shift the blame onto the other person. So even if the narcissistic person, for example, had infidelity, they cheated, they'd say, it's your fault because you didn't pay enough attention to me. So no matter what, no matter how hurt you are in the relationship, they will place the blame on the other person. Over time, it's very much a relationship about control and dominance. The other person feels small. But to truly understand narcissism, it's not enough to just understand the selfishness and entitlement and grandiosity and arrogance. You have to understand what is driving this. Why would someone do this? Because the underneath of it is deep, deep insecurity, deep, deep shame, and a need to be viewed as perfect and special by the world. And anybody who dents, scratches that perfection, they will rage with anger at them, right? And if you try to be kind to them and say, I understand why you're so angry, it's because you're insecure. Rah! My God! Ah! So they can't, there's no capacity, even for a therapist, to give them feedback and say, I understand why this is happening, right? So it's almost like a suit of armor, like right, a metal suit to protect them. We can't be their therapists if we are their partners or their children or their friends. That's not our job. And I think the problem, to your earlier point, is that the world at large almost expects the people who are unlucky enough to be in these relationships to become the trauma therapist for the narcissist.
Right.
That's not going to work. And in that process, the person in the relationship loses themselves.
And it's very hard for the person inside the relationship, be it with their mother or with their spouse, to be able to pinpoint what's happening, because there's something about the narcissist, and you mentioned it, is that they tend to be very charming and they tend to be overpowering and overwhelming. And I think there are two types of whiplash that you describe in the book. One is this difference between their public persona and their private, right? So you see them in public and they're these people like really charming, and people are like, oh, you are so lucky to be with this person. And then when you get to your house, they snap or they do something wrong. But also there's the whiplash inside the relationship, that you have good moments and then you have really bad moments, but then you have more good moments and you think, hey, maybe I'm exaggerating. Um, so, I mean, no, this is a comment on what you said, and I wanted to talk about the types of narcissists you describe, because the one everybody imagines is the grandiose, like the guy that's extremely popular and stuff.
Sure.
But then you mentioned the covert narcissist.
Yeah.
Can you explain
Yeah.
that a bit?
As you said, we typically think of the narcissist as charming, with charisma. Look how great I am. I'm so handsome. My car is so fast. I'll pay the bill for everybody, right? That's what we think of. The problem comes up because many narcissistic people are this form of, we call actually more vulnerable narcissism. This form of narcissism has all those qualities. I said arrogance, entitlement, lack of empathy, but it shows up as victimized, angry, sullen, anxious. Everybody in the world is out to get me. Why doesn't anybody see how great I am? I am special, but nobody tells me I'm special. They're very, we say in English, thin-skinned, like they're easy to provoke. Yeah. People in relationships with this form of narcissism, they feel sorry, right? Because many times for these vulnerable narcissistic people, life doesn't work out the way they want. They often go from job to job to job. I can't, they don't believe me. They don't advance me. They don't promote me. Nobody in this place is nice to me. So they're either getting fired or they're quitting. So they don't really go anywhere. They drop out of school early. I am smarter than the professors, right? So nothing quite comes together. So it's not unusual for them to be stuck living with their parents until they're 50 years old, because they can't create a life. They can't get an apartment. I mean, heaven help the poor person who gets into a relationship with them, because they can't hold a job. So their spouse often has to take a lot of financial responsibility, but that vulnerable narcissist will not help with the children. However, because, and for lack of a better word, the vulnerable narcissist is almost pathetic. So their partner often feels tremendous pity for them. Whereas the grandiose narcissist will go through the world, everybody likes them, they get all the attention, they'll often have an affair. The vulnerable narcissist doesn't have that. The partner always wants to save them, cheer them up. It'll get better. Everything's going to be fine. It's never going to be, but the vulnerable narcissist won't take responsibility that it's their behavior that's causing all the problems. They blame the world constantly for what is happening to them. There's no accountability. So it's a unique form of it that we often miss. And they often look to the world as though they're depressed, they're socially anxious, they're socially unskilled. So we don't think of them as narcissistic, but actually they don't have very much empathy. They do feel entitled. Why should I have to work so hard? His father gave him so much money. Why didn't I have that happen? Right? So it's this sense of, why should I have to do anything? Somebody should just put a bag of money in my door because I'm me. Right? There's that almost kind of thinking. So it's this sort of much more stuck form of narcissism. And because it doesn't look so grandiose, most therapists miss it. Most people miss it. Interesting side fact. You know, in the internet, these trolls, I was talking about that yesterday, the people who write all the terrible things on the internet and who use social media to be bullies and all that, almost all of them are vulnerable narcissists, right? Who never got their voice, but now with an anonymous name, they can say these terrible things and get their power from saying cruel things to other people.
And it's like they prey on empathy because the more you love them, the more you want to understand, you want to help.
Correct.
But you end up justifying what they do. So it's like, no, he's not being mean, he's just sad or depressed.
He's sad, he's depressed, things didn't go his way. And many people, you'll say, well, who would fall in love with this? This is not love bombing. I'll tell you what it is, though. Early in the relationship, and many of you might even say, yeah, I have a tendency to want to rescue people and help people and want to see the good in people. This is where people fall into the trap here, because they'll say, oh, if I could just introduce them to my friend who has this business, or if I could just let them stay in my house or my apartment for a month, or give them my car to use. So people who are helpers, who are rescuers, can easily get pulled into this. You know, it's an interesting story. I once remember a woman, vulnerable narcissist, and I remember that it was just fascinating. Not only was her, for her birthday party, she turned something 40s, 60s, one of these big birthdays. And for her birthday, every one of her friends came into a large theater, and they made, and each of the guests, instead of it being a regular party, they sat in the theater, and each of them came on the stage and did a tribute to her, a song, a poem, a speech, like she was dead. I mean, it's like, right? And she's so happy after that, right? But that happiness only lasted about 10 days. Why can't every day be like that? Oh, the story gets better. The woman goes on through some bit of luck to come into 10 million US dollars. Okay, 10 million. That is life-changing money. And her first response was, oh, this is so difficult. Everybody expects me to pay the dinner bill. You know, and so that's what a vulnerable narcissist does. Even when they have good fortune, it's never enough.
And then you also mentioned that people who love this type of person are usually the most understanding, and then it's the hardest for them to get out of the relationship, because when you tell them, listen, this person is not going to change, they're like, no, everyone can change. And then that kind of empathy and optimism becomes a trap for them.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you said that, because a big mistake we make, and I write about this at length in the book, many people walk through the world and say, oh, I'm a narcissist magnet. I attract narcissists. Or why do I find narcissistic people attractive? You're not a magnet, and nor are you finding them attractive. They are attractive. Let's start there. They're charming, they're confident, they're smart, they're successful. Narcissistic people make more money. Narcissistic people are overrepresented in leadership. Narcissistic people are rated as more physically attractive. What are we all going to go look for ugly people with no money? That's not how we think about
no confidence.
And no confidence. Line me up, right? So the challenge is that it's not the issue who gets into the relationship or meets the person or has a date. The issue is who gets stuck. And the people who get stuck are the empathic people, the forgiving people, the rescuing people, even the optimistic people who believe everyone can change. Pessimists are a little bit protected. They'll say, this is a bum. I don't want to be in this anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I don't mean to get political, but you mentioned it
How
earlier.
can you not?
Yeah, and you were mentioning, I think the same happens, and it's happening to a lot of countries where we live in times of great uncertainty, and the world is changing so fast in so many ways, and people are suffering in in also new ways. Then when this politician comes and says, "Listen, I have every answer. I know how to do
Yes.
this. Just love me and give me all the power, and I'll take you to the promised land." And people are actually
Yes.
voting for that, right?
Yes.
So it's the same.
You're sharing a brilliant insight because when times are uncertain, we choose people who say they have all the answers. But only an arrogant person would say they have all the answers, right? The humility of saying, we're going to have to think about this, we're going to have to come together. Interestingly, in the United States, some years ago, I think the 2016
Known
election.
for having a great president with no,
yeah,
with no
yeah, so
personality
embarrassed.
problems, right?
I sort of hid my passport looking
Sorry, Google on.
It's terrible. But what they found in this interesting study in the 2016 election is that people and on the news, and mostly more of the liberal candidates, they would take more time to answer a question. They would sit for a minute and they'll say, let me think about that. That was rated more often as an incompetence. The person's like, I know the answer. Oh, this is what you know. It's that. And so I think we're in this, I mean, we're going into basically what we could call a fifth industrial revolution, and that's AI, right? People are scared. There's a lot of income uncertainty. People are wondering if they're going to keep jobs. Narcissistic people run governments like people run cults. The same structure. It's a cult, right? And so you show me a narcissistic leader. I don't care if it's a company. I don't care if it's a country. What's underneath them are the people who see it clearly and are punished, and the people who follow blindly because they've absolutely been absorbed into that cultic system unquestioningly. Every cult leader since the dawn of time has been a psychopath or a narcissist, without exception. I don't care if that cult is 5 people or 500,000 people or 300 million people. That's what happens. And in a cult, if somebody speaks out, they are immediately ostracized, which is one of the most harmful things you could do. The greatest punishment a human being can experience, because even though we think we're so technologically savvy, we're still a young species. And several thousand years ago, if we were ostracized, we would die. We needed each other. We don't need each other in the same way, but our bodies haven't caught up to that. That's the theme of FILBO, right? Critical, is the body. The body still thinks we're living in the Stone Age and need each other, right? Apparently, but the question becomes, were there always narcissists? It's something my undergraduate students at the university asked me. Open a history book. I saw the histories. Open a history book. You know who they write about in history books? Narcissists. You think the sweet little baker or the kind miller or the darling blacksmith is who's in the history book? No. The person who took the lands that didn't belong to them, who punished people who were tyrannical kings, that's what history is about, right? So we've always been living in an era of narcissism, right? Now we have a framework to think about it, and it is ridiculously harmful. So yeah, anytime you have this kind of narcissistic leader who says they have all the answers, it's cultic and it's narcissistic.
Yes, and then the topic of enablers becomes a societal problem, right? Because it's not only that we have the narcissistic president, but then we have the entire society enabling him and saying, no, if you criticize him or if you point him out as a narcissist, you are missing the point. We need this type of solution, right? And then you also mention it on the individual level, that they tell the survivor, like, don't leave, you are misunderstanding him.
Correct.
You have to, sorry,
Right.
I don't know if it's
Yes, that makes sense. So an enabler is a person who continues to embolden and give power to the narcissistic person by saying things like, they don't mean it, they want what's good for you, I think you misunderstood what they said, they're often quite nice to me, right? And what they do is they magnify the doubt of the person in the relationship, right? Number one. But they also means that the narcissistic person has very little incentive to change because there's a lot of enablers around them. One thing to remember about enablers, and it's very interesting, if you look at the work of Dr. Judith Herman, and I'm sure her work has been translated into Spanish, to me, she is the most important trauma writer of our time. And she says that the majority of people, like I said, are committed to the status quo. They want to keep their idea of everything. We want the family to get together. So if you point out someone that's narcissistic, you're rocking the boat. You're causing a problem. But here's what to remember, and I think it's a good, simple way to think about enablers. Enablers tend to be, I hate to say it, let me use a better term. Enablers are very selfish and self-centered. They're choosing what works for them and not at all accounting how something might hurt someone else. You've had friends like that, right? Who've supported a harmful friend, and you're like, how can you not see how this is hurting me? What's working for them? And that's what an enabler does. There's a selfishness. So even in government, what we see is the person who votes for the narcissistic, tyrannical leader, they tend to be voting from a place of self-interest. I know some people in states will say, I know this person's terrible, but this one policy, even though hundreds of thousands of people will be harmed, this one policy will benefit me. I'm willing to ruin the lives of all those people to have this one thing for me. Now take that out of government and put that in a family. I'm willing to sit by silently and let my family member be harmed because this all works for me. That's what an enabler does. And it is very courageous to be the person who steps up and says, this isn't okay. The way this person is conducting themselves is not okay because it's such a threat to the system, and that tends to be not what people do.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned trauma, I want to go back to the victims and the survivors, and I want to quote you. You say, narcissistic abuse can leave you believing that there is something wrong with you, right? And everything about what you've explained so far makes the victim doubt themselves and feel like, no, maybe I'm exaggerating or something like that. But what you mentioned in the book and from your past experiences, people are actually suffering a lot of different consequences because of this depression, anxiety. They see their life projects. So can you please like share a little bit about the damage that this does to a person?
Yeah. The damage this does to a person is so significant. And that's why I got into this line of work. The one thing I want to emphasize is that what happens to a person in a narcissistic relationship, to me, is not an illness and it is not a pathology. It is normal. It is what any human being would experience if they were chronically exploited and silenced. And the problem is, we often view the survivors of these relationships as though they have something wrong with them. We use words like anxiety because it's true, but anxiety and distraction and rumination and regret and helplessness and powerlessness, that makes it seem as though there's something wrong with someone. But if someone for years, decades, maybe even lifetimes has told you you're not enough, you're wrong, your reality is wrong, has made you feel smaller and smaller, and you learn that the only way I can be loved is if I live in psychological service to this person, anyone is going to have this we call fallout, and this fallout, like I said, is rumination, it's regret, it's anxiety, sadness, anger, loneliness, isolation, self-blame, self-doubt, sometimes even what we call mild dissociation. It's not as though you have multiple identities, but you know how people are like, hey, where are you? Come back. You're often just someplace else because you can't cope with what's happening in front of you, and your body almost tries to protect you and sort of pulls you out. People who go through this experience significant health problems. I was just talking to a woman today here, who's a Colombian woman, who has started an amazing foundation, and she was saying how her health deteriorated to almost nothing. She was having kidney problems, heart problems. I've heard it all. 70% of people going through this have autoimmune issues. We see people have difficulties with sleep. They don't take care of their health. Why would they? It's almost like you're dehumanized, right? People won't they don't eat as well. There's so much disruption in the life, and in some cases, some people will drink or smoke or do things that are harmful, but just as a way to cope. And I'm telling you, this is universal. This phenomenon is something we've observed in just about every culture in the world I've spoken in and been at. We're actually in the process of doing the research to create a test to measure this so we can really capture this and write up this data. But here's where it gets interesting. I remember one woman wrote to me and she said, I was married for some 40 years to a very abusive, narcissistic man. I had all kinds of health problems. My health was terrible. I was very sad. I was struggling. I was isolated. And suddenly the husband died. In 1 month, her health improved so significantly. Her doctor said to her, this doesn't make sense. Ran the test, because it wouldn't make sense. Well, it made all the sense in the world. But this isn't even something a doctor would ask about. And she said, I felt so guilty because for a month I had to walk around and pretend to be the grieving widow. But she said it was the greatest relief of my life. Yeah. And my health came flowing back. Now, obviously, we cannot organize the death of narcissistic people, and they live a very long time because they're causing the stress for everybody. But I'm not kidding you. I gave a lecture in London, and everyone was saying, yeah, this narcissist is 90, 95, 96. And I'm like, apparently, the answer to a long life is be narcissistic. So there you go.
It's being an awful, right? The symptoms you mentioned when I was reading the book, I've been suffering from depression for quite a while. So this is from the point from where
Thank you for sharing.
Where I approached this. And I remember that Andrew Solomon, he once wrote, I'm probably going to misquote him, but he said that depression is being absent from yourself. And what I got from the narcissist victim is that they eventually become absent from themselves. Right. And I mean, in the big issues, but also I remember one person saying, I don't even know what kind of TV to watch.
Correct.
Like,
but I'd say that what I would argue is that the person who goes through the narcissistic relationship gets fragmented, right, because they can't be their true self. Right. Because if they show up as their true self, they will be so criticized, so demeaned, so devalued. They tried. So if a person has a narcissistic parent, yeah, they often don't even get to develop that true self, and that becomes the hard work of adulthood. If a person got to develop that in childhood, but then enters an adult relationship, they have to constantly silence that true self, right? So we fragment into these pieces because you're trying to protect that true self, that if it emerges, will get harmed. And basically, these fragments, they do protect us. And even when we think, what's the old saying that depression is about looking back and anxiety is about looking forward. That's how we think of those two symptoms, right? So depression is regret and anxiety is fear for the future, right? I think people going through narcissistic relationships have both of those phenomena playing. But another thing to remember is many people who go through narcissistic relationships actually they'll do quite well when they're with their friends. This is why they're also tricky for psychologists or counselors, because they'll say, I had a weekend with my friends. We went for a fun getaway and I was happy and laughing and I was my real self. And then I came back and I was immediately silenced, right? So we'll see that people go through these relationships can go to work and do well. They can be very attentive parents. They can be good friends. But in this one relationship, they're silent. Another thing to remember about narcissism is it's on a continuum from mild to severe. And the mild side, emotional immaturity, emotional stuntedness, pathological selfishness, those are the main features. Their manipulation isn't as skilled. You would feel the pain of the mild narcissistic person, for example, if you were trying to raise children with them, because they're not helping. So you're going to work, you're raising the kids, they're acting foolish, they're playing video games, they're 50 years old. You just want to say, grow up, right? Now, when you go to the severe end of the narcissistic spectrum, here is where we see exploitation, coercive control, isolation, sometimes physical violence, and other forms of aggression. And all of this is different than psychopathy. Psychopathy and narcissism are not the same thing. Psychopathy is something, I would argue, more severe, more cold, more callous. And the big difference between the psychopath and the narcissist is that the psychopath does not feel any guilt or remorse for their actions. Believe it or not, the narcissistic person does feel guilty when they do something bad, but they don't like that feeling of guilt. It very quickly turns to shame, and they get mad at you, even though you're the person they wronged, because your existence is reminding them of their shame. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, but the psychopathic person will feel 0.000% shame. So, in a relationship, a psychopathic person, extremely dangerous. And we see psychopathic people in governmental positions. We see them in corporate positions. So by some estimates, 25% of CEOs are psychopathic or narcissistic.
Well, that's reassuring.
Yeah, right? I know, right? I mean, could you, but think about it.
Yeah.
Could you go into a company, deliberately destroy parts of it for profit, and then lay off 50,000 people the day before Christmas?
Yeah.
I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
I don't care how much money you gave me. I'd rather be broke.
Yeah. And you mentioned something I want to talk about as families, right? And I think it's especially important in Colombia because we do have a very like, strong familial
Family
tradition. And something interesting about how narcissistic abuse happens in families is that you mention a lot of mothers. And especially because when people talk about narcissism, they think, oh, it's probably men. And you say, yeah, a lot of men, but not only men. And a lot of friends who are women have talked to me and said, yeah, I have this really difficult relationship with my mother because I'm taught to love her and to respect her and to do everything she wants. But she's a narcissist. So can you tell us a little bit about how that happens inside families and what does that do?
It's very harmful to have a narcissistic parent. It really is. Because the narcissistic parent views a child as existing to fulfill their needs. They don't see the child as an individual separate from that, right? And so the child, as the child gets older, is shamed for having a need separate from the parent, for having a want separate from the parent, for having an ambition separate from the parent. And the parent feels that the child owes them something, time, gratitude, their life, whatever it may be. And the parent, well into adulthood, will remind that adult child, I did so much for you. I gave you life. I didn't ask you to do that. Okay. I gave you life. I fed you. I made the roof on your head. I gave you clothing, minimum requirements, by the way. But that is used to coerce the adult child to do what that parent wants. Yeah. And if the adult child doesn't, then they're called grateful and ungrateful and all these things, right? So having a narcissistic parent significantly shapes somebody. And in most cases, what it results in is a very anxious adult who doubts their abilities, who doubts their capacities, who doubts themselves in relationships, who feels like they're not good enough, who constantly second guesses themselves, who feels like if they try, and this is the paradox. When you have a narcissistic parent, if you do too well, then you're worried you're being competitive with the parent. If you don't do well enough, then you're afraid you'll be rejected. So you're constantly trying to find this perfect middle ground.
Yeah.
And so children of narcissistic parents live in this eternal guilt where they constantly feel overly beholden to the parent and absolutely angered by it. And in a family-oriented culture, like Colombia, like most Latin cultures, most South American cultures, there's really not the option. You see more people in the United States, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. Right? There'd be so much shame. You only have one mother, you only have one father, or even if that parent is able to wear 2 masks into the public, oh, they're so involved in the church, they're so involved in the community, you're so lucky this is your parent, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get any support.
And then you have to take care of them when they get old.
You have to
and
take care of them. And if you think they're not nice when they're younger, wait till they get older. And they will expect you to fully, I did all this for you. And if a narcissistic person starts to experience dementia, it gets complicated. Maybe about a third of cases, you see a softening of the narcissism, but in the other 2/3 of the cases, you see an agitation. And in fact, it can be very difficult to find a placement like a nursing care or a nursing center because it's unsafe. If someone has dementia, they can walk in the street, they can get hurt, but they cause so much trouble that the place says, I don't want this person, right? So the adult children are forever in a cycle of having to find a place for this person and screaming and yelling and cruelty and all of that. So you feel like this is the most unforgiving thing. And a lot of people hold a false hope that one day this parent will finally get it. They wait for what we call the deathbed confession, right? That perfect moment.
The ICU moment.
And
Right?
but it doesn't happen. And so the death of a narcissistic parent can be a very, very confusing time. My friend David Kessler, he said such an important thing because grief is such a universal part of these relationships. He studies grief and he says, we grieve those we like, we grieve those we love, and we grieve those we hate. Anytime there's a loss in a human life, we grieve it. But the loss of those who have harmed us, especially if it's a parent, is extraordinarily complicated.
So we have 5 minutes. So I'm gonna have one last question for you,
Okay.
but you can start thinking about what you wanna ask the doctor, and then we'll open for questions. So your book is also about hope and about healing and about empowering people. So maybe I wanna end our conversation with that, and it's
Absolutely.
what's your message to victims, and how do you help them heal, and also because you say healing has a lot of phases, like healing is not only leaving the relationship, maybe you stay in the relationship and you find. So
The natural process of a human being is to heal. If you get a cut, you heal. If you break a bone, you heal. And if you break a heart, you heal. Even if you break a soul, you heal. I think the most important thing is to know that it's possible. The second most important thing is that you are not defined by this relationship, even though for the longest time we believed we could. But I think another thing that's also very important to keep in mind is these relationships feel very black and white. They're all bad or they're all good. And that it's an impossible way to think about someone who's important in our life, a spouse, a parent. So I call, I don't want to use a technical term, so I'm just going to call it multiple things can be true at the same time. And I remember I've had patients, I give them a piece of paper and I say, I want you to write everything that's true about this relationship. And sometimes they'll write things like, I have a mother, I hate her, she was cruel to me, I love her, I worry about her, somebody has to take care of her. Sometimes she played with me as a child. I do have fond memories of her. I'm afraid of her. She makes me feel small. Do those sentences all line up? Not at all. So you can imagine the tension you feel. But by putting it in one place, it helped her healing because it allowed her to build compassion for herself. She used that as permission to say, I have to be very careful how I engage. especially in families, and I recognize in your culture, you can't leave. Not everyone can even leave a narcissistic marriage or relationship. But what you can do is you can disengage. Sadly, it becomes a very superficial relationship. Maybe the most you can talk about is the weather, or the moon, or the rain, or the football, or something like that. You can't talk about much else. And so one of the key ingredients to healing is support. Human beings in your life who see you, who see all of you. We desperately wanted that to be our parents, our spouses, our siblings. But that's not always the hand we're dealt. And as human beings, we can learn to adapt into other relationships, but also find meaning and purpose for what matters to us. Again, I was talking to a woman today who went through horrific narcissistic abuse, had her son kidnapped by her narcissistic partner, and she's devoted all of her efforts to creating a foundation and trying to change Colombian family law. So for her, the conversion is, how do we find meaning and purpose? I've been through this many times. And it's funny, I started doing this work before I was aware of that. But then I thought, every time someone questions me, I think, well, this is very real. Not only have I seen it in hundreds of patients, I've gone through this. So we find ways. And what I always say too is sometimes don't take on the idea of changing the world. Because if you try to take that on, we'll all shut down. So you can take a page out of Voltaire and basically say, just tend to your own garden. Just tend to your own garden, which means that we give 90% of our time to the most toxic people in our lives, saving 10% for those that make us grow and thrive and the best of us, right? Because the 10%, those people are going to love us no matter what. Flip the math. Give the 90% to the good folks. And whether you give 10% or 150% to the toxic folks, it's never gonna get better. And if you can even view you as a resource, that becomes important. And you slowly but surely, as you radically accept and recognize it won't change, your true self will emerge. It's a journey and it's a process and it's a weight we carry on our backs. I have seen so many stories of healing. It is unreal. I mean, I have seen unbelievable stories. I know it can happen. I've healed. I know it's possible. Do I have moments? Will I leave this saying, oh my God, I sounded so stupid in the bookstore? Yes, I will. But I view that as the little girl in me who still feels that way because that's what she was told. And instead of saying, oh God, you're so neurotic, you can literally draw your arms around that devastated part of you and say, I got you, because you ain't that. That's how you heal.
And you can give her the purple dress,
And
right?
you can give her the purple dress.
When you get the book, you'll get it. An applause for the doctor, please.
How many questions do you have?
So, okay. Yeah.
You have to tell me if you're going to be in English or Spanish, otherwise I gotta get myself all.
Hello, doctor.
Oh, good.
It's gonna be English. Don't worry
Okay.
about it. I could ask you 1,000 things. I'm sure, but I think I'm gonna be I'm gonna ask the simplest one since we don't have 1,000 years. Basically, what I wanted to know, and I'm not sure if you talked about it before. I'm asking for a friend, but I wanted to know if there are levels of narcissism. What I mean is, for example, you have a narcissistic parent, and sometimes they don't seem narcissistic, or sometimes they are extremely narcissistic. Are there levels, or is it like it's always going to be the same, and that's why your parent is not narcissistic? Or there can be moments when it's enhanced, or moments when they are not, when they're I don't want to use the word normal, but I wouldn't know how to say it otherwise. But are there levels? Is it like a dial that you can that they can go in?
By definition, thank you for your question. By definition, every narcissistic relationship is the way you describe. If this person was always difficult, all the time, always difficult with you, always difficult with everyone, there would be no confusion. You'd say, this is just a terrible person. That's not what's happening here. The unique element of these relationships is that there are sometimes very beautiful moments, very loving moments, very connected moments. I'm going to give you a personal example. I had that happen with me recently. Somebody very long time in my life, deeply narcissistic. I have completely disengaged. And I'd say it's been a long time since this person did a kindness. And then they did something very attuned. I'll be frank with you, it was worse. Because if they had stayed so difficult, but they challenged my schema, right? And I was so sad because the gesture was a very kind one and it was not one I could accommodate because I was about to catch an airplane. It would have required time. And they looked very almost sad and deflated. And I felt guilty, right? As though I was a bad person that didn't accommodate this person's kind gesture, right? It took me back to being a child, where just when I would say, oh, this is not okay, they would maybe do something kind, give me a candy or give me a book or something like that. And those moments would chronically confuse me. Back to the multiple things being true. This is a person who did not do right by me. They did try to do right, but interestingly, they did it on their own schedule. They never thought to consult with me and say, I'd like to do this with you. When are you available? I'm the busiest person I know. And they thought magically I'd be available. Didn't even think that a packed suitcase at the doorway might mean I'm leaving. That lack of observing, right? A little girl would never have known that, but a grown person would have. Does that make sense? So always these relationships are this. And by understanding that that's what they are, and those moments that are bad are the moments of the narcissistic person, in essence, life isn't going the way they want, and they feel like they can take that out on you. But a healthy adult learns to regulate their emotions, especially around children. So when the parent is having a bad day, it's the parent's responsibility to say, this is not my child's problem. I need to get this together. Whatever I scream into a pillow, breathe, whatever, but this is not my child's problem. Narcissistic people make it the child's problem. The child has to carry the burden of the parent's shame. That is too heavy a weight for a child to carry. So as we come to adulthood and we see these almost pathetic little moments that these parents come up with, we can say to ourselves, and this is very important for you to remember, many people are worried that the narcissistic person stole your compassion. They didn't. You're incredibly compassionate people. And that people say, well, if I'm nice to them, then they're winning. No, 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 no. They lost a long time ago. They're stuck with this personality they're not addressing. Us holding back our compassion is when we lose. Us having a compassion. I could have gotten mad. What the hell is wrong with you? Can't you see I'm going to the airport? No, I said, I'm so sorry. I'm leaving. But perhaps we could try to do this another time. Thank you for asking. Right? Some will say, did you enable him? I didn't enable him. Enabling him would have been changing my flight. Right? But I said, maybe another time. But what I didn't be was cruel. Because if I was cruel, then I carry that burden of shame. Make sense?
Yes.
That's what this is about.
Thank
you. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Ramani. In Colombia and Latin America, we have a lot of romantic soap operas.
Romantic
Soap operas, so like
Soapy?
films.
Oh, soap operas. Yes.
Yes. So kind of
Like telenovela.
yes,
Yeah.
that's it.
Got
So I and I would like to know if in your experience you have had trouble with your patients. They want to believe that the soap opera told them is going to happen.
Oh, heck yeah. Disney.
Yes.
Disney.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I'm going to fall asleep and someone's going to kiss me and it'll be fine, which is actually not consensual. I'm going to lose a shoe and the prince is going to come. There's going to be a beast and we're going to dance around. And the telenovela is a great example.
Yes.
Because these are adults. So at least you think it's a cartoon, maybe, but adults looking at these telenovelas see these very dramatic relationships work out. I hope one of you, maybe one of you is a producer, could make a telenovela that shows narcissistic relationships realistically. Personally, I think it would be a hit. More and more telenovelas are taking on the issue of toxic relationships. I'm happy to see that. I'd like to see them more consistently and more accurately, but I have to say I'm pleased to see that telenovelas are taking on the issue of domestic violence, which is good, but they can't give it a nice happy ending, and it would be nice to realistically show the struggle. I know that's not as entertaining, but it actually could be better for younger generations, and it could open the eyes of older generations who watch these shows. But no, I absolutely think, I think it's poison. When we, again, how many times have we seen somebody abuses someone, and then they have some wake-up moment, and then if they go off into the sunset, I'm like, oh my gosh, they're just gonna abuse you once you're married. Don't do this. I'm screaming at the television.
No, they're telling me we're out of time. I'm really sorry. But
Thank you. I'm so sorry. I wish I could answer more questions. I would have stayed here all night. I really would have.
Doctor, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your attention. Can I have someone to take a picture and send it to me? I think it's on the stage, because I don't even have my phone here. Just something, I have to give you my contact information. I would. Thank you so much.
Another applause, please. Thank you, doctor.
Es narcisista.
Para recordar
Thank
que
you.
mañana también en la FILBO.
So you're going to be tomorrow at FILBO,
Yes,
you know.
sí.